Yes, we normally talk to Mike Griffith late on Thursday, but unfortunately, Griff has to head out of town on a family situation, of which we hate to hear. But Mike, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us, and we're certainly hoping for good things with you and your family as you travel.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. You're right. We got a huge weekend ahead. And, Georgia would seemingly not have that big of an opponent in Tennessee Tech. But as Kirby Smart said, so many things to fix after beating Clemson 34-3. The margin for error when you're number one, Paul, you know this. It's not a great one. And Georgia's got a lot of things to work on and get better at as they brush up for their schedule. I mean, you got Kentucky, road trips to Kentucky and Alabama coming up. And oh my gosh, doesn't Kalen DeBoer look like he's got Alabama going? I heard him talking on the teleconference this week about all the changes he made to Nick Saban's schedule and practices and how well these guys have done. And surely they'll fare better against South Florida than Saban did last year. I would think it'll be a bigger margin of victory than, 14 points last year for Saban over South Florida?
Yeah, don't forget, Mike. It was a late score that made it 14. The game was in doubt until then. So let me just.
One of the best coaching. Wait a minute. One of the best coaching jobs ever for Nick Saban last year. Let's not forget the narrative here. I just want to remind everybody that that was one of the best ever. So if DeBoer can outdo that, then man, the tide is really off and running.
One question on Georgia, and I know a lot of people saw the score and they go, "Man, this was a rout." It wasn't a rout in
No.
the first half. As you have dug into the program this week, talking to players, talking to coaches, and obviously having watched the game over there in Atlanta, what was the first half really all about?
Well, I mean, a lot of punches being thrown, both teams kind of filling one another out, and Georgia really not getting their best personnel out there early. I mean, it turned out that freshman Nate Frazier was their best running back on the team and probably the MVP of the game. I know everything seems to go to quarterbacks automatically, but Frazier was probably the biggest difference, his ability to break open runs. And I'll tell you, Georgia had a freshman on the other side that led the team in snaps, KJ Bolden. There was a lot of newcomers, a lot of these guys that have to step up into holes. There were a lot of questions that were answered for Georgia with newcomers. London Humphreys, this transfer from Vanderbilt, I knew he'd bring up the team GPA, but I had no idea he'd be the leading receiver in terms of yardage in the first game and score a touchdown. They got a Vanderbilt transfer scoring touchdowns. They got a freshman in Frazier leading the team in rushing. They got a newcomer from Miami scoring touchdowns. They got a freshman safety playing more snaps than anybody. Jalen Walker emerges maybe the most dangerous weapon in the league. I mean, this hybrid linebacker can line up anywhere. So Georgia had a lot of questions answered, but I'll tell you, Paul, what happened was halftime adjustments. And I did an enterprise story on this week. I talked to a lot of SEC coaches about the impact of the radio and helmet and the iPad and what is going to happen as we move forward. And I think some coaches are able to make better use of this technology. I mean, this is immediate feedback. It's who can correct. It's who has the most coachable kids. It's who can strategize the best. And I think Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo and Glenn Schumann, I think they coached circles around Clemson, and those halftime adjustments led to those 4 touchdowns in the second half for the Bulldogs.
Uh, you mentioned cleaning things up. I heard Dabo Sweeney's press conference the other day. You may have. He doesn't pay attention to the criticism. He doesn't read any of it. He knows who he is, and he loves his job. Your takeaway from Dabo coaching and then the aftermath.
Probably loves being in the ACC outside of playing Miami. I don't know. I don't know that anybody's going to beat Clemson in the ACC this year. That's a good football team. That team has a good front seven, and they have a very good offensive line. The quarterback play is not championship level, but it's good enough in the ACC to probably win 10 or 11 games. I like Clemson a lot. I understand what Dabo's saying, Paul. I do. He believes in his kids, and why go out and get somebody else if they're not better than what you already have? Maybe Clemson just doesn't have the money to get those guys. Maybe he's just too proud to say that because they have pursued some players, but they haven't been able to outbid some of the heavyweight programs to get these guys. I'm not selling Dabo down the river yet. I don't think it's over. That first half was very much in doubt. In fact, if Klubnik makes a few more better throws and if some passes aren't dropped, the narrative changes. I mean, it really wasn't that far off from. I'm not saying they would have won the game. They never would have won that game. You play that game 100 times, and Georgia's going to win it 100 times. But I don't think Clemson's that far off. I think Georgia's that good. So not ready to dump on Dabo quite yet. I want to see what they do this week against Appalachian State. I expect them to cover that 17-point spread.
Yeah, Appalachian State's a good program. I want to go back to Alabama for a second, and I
Yeah.
assume you were just being farcical or facetious about Kalen DeBoer, but Griff, let me tell you something. Bama fans that we've talked to this week, they believe they have an upgrade.
Well, I I'm not ready to Paul, I'm not ready to bite on that one. I mean, Nick Saban is a seven-time championship coach, but he did a bad job at the start of last year, losing by double digits at home to Texas. That was not a good coaching job. They did not have Jalen Milroe ready, and it's clear that Kalen DeBoer has struck the right note with Milroe. I mean, Milroe is looking like the player we all think he could be. Now, here's the question: can Milroe run the ball that much and stay healthy? It's a long season. This is a long season. That was a pretty win over Western Kentucky. It really was. And the defense, I have to applaud. I called them out last week, and to get a shutout over a team like that, never mind that their head coach passed on Michael Penix and said he wasn't good enough, but still, that Helton guy up there has won a few games and they put some points on the board. That was an impressive margin of victory. I do want to see how it goes against South Florida. I think South Florida is a little better opponent, but I do think DeBoer will keep the pedal down, and we'll see how that defense does. And I was not being facetious. DeBoer has done a better job at the beginning of the season than Saban did last year, and that's what I talked about the whole offseason was wait a minute, maybe this guy will do a better job early in the season. Now it remains to be seen how he manages this team through the season. Adversity will hit. And as we all know, it's what you do when adversity strikes that kind of separates the programs. But I like listening to DeBoer. He's a proud guy. It's not. This is going to be Saban Field, by the way. You realize, right? So Nick Saban will essentially be on the field, maybe not in person, but in name at least. He'll be back on the field, Paul. But this is a weekend that could have some potential distractions. But DeBoer doesn't seem to care. Fanfare Nick Saban all you want. Name the field after him. He's going to do things his way. He's already changed it up with practices. He's changing it up on offense. He's changing up in drills. He's changing up the mentality and the approach to the game. I think they're leaving the uniforms the same for now, at least. Kalen DeBoer's leaving the same. But my point is, this guy's doing it his way, fearlessly. So let's see how that goes. So far, so good. You're one game in. I thought it looked great. I think they'll dominate South Florida. I think the Tide's going to have a lot of momentum moving forward. I think they got that game with Wisconsin. That might be a little more telltale matchup.
Finally, with Mike Griffin, and Mike, many times we've spoken to you in the last couple of years. I've heard you reference this show and an interview that we did some time ago with Scott Strickland.
You sat down with, as I recall, I think you sat down with Scott Strickland, was not last summer, but the summer before, right?
Sure.
And he talked about the patience that he was going to have. And I think you had a recent interview with him, and he said he'd be patient again. I think about that time someone knocked on the door and said, "Hey, Scott, we're not going to be patient with you if you're going to be patient with him." Because what I'm hearing out of Gainesville, Paul, is the money's getting raised. They're putting it together. It's not if, it's when. I don't know the buyout numbers. I haven't researched it. I'm not a Florida beat writer. I've been very busy covering the number one team in the country. There was a time Florida was a challenge and you might invest some time in them, but right now you just don't. They're kind of a non-factor in the league. We've got this AJC power poll. They sunk all the way down to 15th in the league. And this group of writers that vote, Paul. I mean, no one really pays. Vanderbilt, for goodness sakes, ranked like 3 spots ahead of him. So, but yeah, the drums are beating. I don't know what you do. I don't know who takes the job mid-season. I don't know if you pull the rug out from. I'm not going to suggest that Steve Spurrier, should take over, or Jimbo Fisher, or anybody like that. I don't think Jamie Chadwell will leave Liberty mid-season. So it's just kind of a big mess. The good news is you're going to see a fantastic freshman take the field. You're going to see an overpowered opponent. The Gators will get a win, and those who don't know anything about football will cheer wildly and be happy and think there's hope, and the rest of the people will wring their hands and can only wonder what's next. I know this, Paul, we've talked about this. I don't know if there's a more popular and likable athletic director in college football than Scott Strickland. And Billy Napier can't be saved, but I sure hope Florida keeps Scott Strickland. I think he's a great guy and does a great job. And Napier's a nice guy. He's a good guy. We've talked about this. He'll land on his feet somewhere. He did say in his press conference he does pay close attention to these FCS teams, and I'm sure there'll be one of those teams waiting for him.
And speaking of Scott, a week ago, he did sit down with us again, and he doubled down, and he said all the things that you've referenced. We will be there again next Friday, Griff. I'm curious, what would you do if you were Scott Strickland asked about Billy Napier now?
I would probably avoid the interview. And from what I understand, I think he actually Listen, Scott has a lot of people over every now and then. I don't know if there's a party big enough to save Billy Napier, but the job that he's done and the kind of person Scott Strickland is, I mean, surely Florida people can see. Look, he missed on Billy Napier, and he's not the only athletic director to try to go out there and hire some Nick Saban knockoff and think that it's going to work. A lot of ads have failed and gone down that road, and let's just bring somebody in that does things like Nick, but is younger and looks better behind the pole. It just doesn't work that way. There's only one Nick Saban, and it's not as simple as implementing what Saban does to have success. As I said, DeBoer basically just tore up the pages of the Nick Saban playbook and said, I'm bringing my own. You're hiring me. You ain't hiring some Nick Saban clone. Hopefully a lesson can be learned from this, though, right? You need to be able to have guys that come in that do things their way. If you get an imitation or a knockoff, it's just not going to be the same. And that's what Billy Napier was. He was kind of a cheap knockoff. He'd had a good resume. He'd coached under Saban. He'd coached under Dabo, but he really hadn't done anything to differentiate himself. And he was clearly in over his head. So I understand the hire. We've seen other programs do the same thing. I mean, Jeremy Pruitt, Derek Dooley, for whatever reasons, didn't work out at Tennessee. I just think Florida needs to go out and get a true original. And again, I told you his name is Jamie Chadwell. He's up there at Liberty. He wears a visor. He shoots from the hip. That's the best hire they could make.
Mike Griffith joining us early. Mike, all the best. We'll talk to you next week. So thank you very much for joining us. And we have a lot to